The bell above the door of the Redemption General Store chimed a cheerful tinny lie. There was no cheer in the dusty air, thick with the scent of dried beans, cured leather, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Arthur Blackwood stood by the counter, his hand resting on a sack of flour. The coarse weave a poor anchor in the swirling currents of his memory. Beside him, his daughter Lily, a 6-year-old wisp of a girl, clutched a small, clumsily carved wooden bird. Her silence was a physical presence in the room, a void that consumed all sound. It had been a year to the day since her mother Sarah was buried, and a year to the day since Lily had last spoken. The storekeeper, a balding man named Abernathy, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, was measuring out sugar, his movements slow and deliberate. A young woman, a new face in town with kind eyes and a splash of freckles across her nose, was restocking shelves. She caught Lily's eye and offered a small conspiratorial smile, then held up a bright red licorice whip. Lily's gaze flickered to the candy, a spark of childish interest in her otherwise vacant expression. But she didn't move. That was when the door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that made the jars on the shelves tremble. 3 men filled the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the blinding, indifferent sun. The man in the center stepped forward, and the light caught the silver conchos on his hatband. He was handsome in a cruel, predatory way, with a smile that never reached his eyes. This was Silas Finch. His reputation of foul wind had preceded him into town. Mr. Abernathy Finch purred his voice, a low, mocking drawl. "It seems your establishment is in need of a charitable contribution for the continued health of its proprietor." His 2 companions fanned out, their pistols drawn. One was a hulking brute with a vacant stare. The other was wiry and nervous, his eyes darting around the store like a cornered rat. Arthur felt the world tilt. The smell of gun oil, the sharp, sudden violence. It was a ghost from a past that he had tried to bury deep in the arid soil of his ranch. His hand, which had once been so steady, so quick, felt leaden at his side, useless. The memory of Sarah, pale and feverish in their bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps after a stray bullet from a pointless skirmish had shattered her health, rose like a suffocating shroud. He had brought that violence into her life. His past had killed her. And in that moment, as Finch's man shoved Mr. Abernathy against the counter, Arthur was paralyzed by the same crushing helplessness he had felt by her bedside. He was a statue of grief, a monument to failure. Lily, sensing the shift in the air, pressed herself against his leg, her tiny body trembling. The young woman with the licorice whip had frozen, her hand still outstretched. The wiry outlaw noticed her, a greedy glint in his eye. "Well, now what have we here?" he sneered, stepping toward her. "Leave her be." Abernathy pleaded, his voice thin with terror. "Take what you want." Finch chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "My associate is merely admiring the local produce." The young woman, seeing the man's approach, took a small, instinctive step back, shielding Lily with her body. She dropped the licorice whip and gave Lily a quick, reassuring look, a silent promise of protection. It was a small kindness, a flicker of courage in the face of ugliness, and it was the last act of her life. The wiry outlaw, perhaps startled by her movement, or simply drunk on his own, power lunged. The woman cried out a short, sharp sound of surprise. There was a sickening thud as he struck her with the barrel of his pistol. She crumpled to the floorboards, a splash of red licorice landing beside her still form. Silence. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in a soundless world. He saw the licorice. He saw Lily's wide, terrified eyes. He saw the ghost of Sarah. He had done nothing. A man stood before him, a protector of a child, and he had done nothing. The paralysis broke, replaced by a cold, searing rage, but it was too late. He was a moment behind the world, a step behind fate. Finch glanced down at the woman, his lip curling in annoyance. Clumsy, he said, not to his man, but to the room at large. He looked directly at Arthur, then his gaze sweeping over him with dismissive contempt. He saw the tall, broad-shouldered frame, the calloused hands, but he also saw the haunted look in his eyes. He saw a broken man. "Your daughter Finch?" asked his voice, laced with false sympathy. A shame she had to see such unpleasantness. He gestured to his men. They swept the cash from the register, grabbed a few bottles of whiskey, and backed toward the door. Finch paused, his eyes lingering on Arthur for a second longer. "Some men are built to protect what's theirs," he said the words, a casual, cutting observation. "And some are not." Then they were gone, leaving behind the chime of the bell, the scent of fear, and the profound echoing silence of Arthur's failure. He knelt, his movements stiff and mechanical beside the fallen woman. There was no pulse. Her kind eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. Lily let out a choked, silent sob and buried her face in Arthur's coat, the carved bird pressed so tightly in her fist that the wood bit into her palm. Arthur gathered his daughter into his arms, his own grief a suffocating weight. He had failed again. He had stood by and let the darkness win, and another innocent life had been extinguished in the shadow of his inaction. The sun bleached the color from the sky, leaving a canvas of pale, dusty blue over canyons carved by a forgotten river. Arthur's ranch was a lonely outpost in this skeletal expanse of rock and thorn, a place where hope came to die. The weeks following the robbery were a blur of self-recrimination. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window frames sounded like an accusation. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It was a physical presence that seeped through the walls, a damp, persistent chill that clung to him like a shroud. He worked from dawn until dusk, his body aching with a fatigue that never reached the frantic energy of his mind. He mended fences that weren't broken and reshod horses that didn't need it, seeking oblivion in mindless labor. But the image of the young woman on the floor of Finch's mocking eyes was seared into his memory. Some men are built to protect what's theirs, and some are not. The words were a brand on his soul. Lily had retreated even further into herself. She no longer sat on the porch step. She spent her days in the darkest corner of the main room, her back to the world, her small shoulders hunched. The carved bird was her only companion. She traced its wooden wings for hours, her thumb rubbing the pine smooth, a desperate, repetitive ritual of self-soothing. One evening, staring into the bottom of a whiskey glass, the familiar, bitter companionship of despair, his only solace, Arthur knew he couldn't continue. The ranch was a tomb, and he and Lily were its ghosts. He needed noise. He needed a distraction, something visceral to shock his system out of its stupor. He needed to feel something other than the slow, grinding erosion of guilt. He saddled his horse and rode into Redemption, the town a smear of lantern light against the bruised twilight sky. He wasn't looking for trouble, not consciously. He was looking for a reprieve, however fleeting. He found it in the stale, smoky air of the saloon. The place was a cacophony of drunken laughter, shoddy piano music, and the sharp click of poker chips. It was an ugly symphony, but it was loud enough to drown out the voice in his head. And there, holding court at the center table, was Silas Finch. He was flush with the success of his recent exploits, basking in the fearful respect of the other patrons. He was telling a story, his voice carrying over the din, and the men around him hung on every word, their laughter sycophantic. Arthur felt a familiar toxic mix of rage and shame. He should have done something. He should have been the man he once was. He took a seat at the table, his face a stony mask. He didn't want to be there, but he couldn't leave. It was as if a grim magnetic force held him in place. Finch noticed him, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, Blackwood," he drawled, "come to tempt fate again." The game began. The cards were dealt, the bets were made. Arthur played with a cold, reckless abandon, his mind 1,000 miles away. He won a hand, then another. The pile of chips in front of him grew, but he felt no satisfaction. It was then that Finch decided to raise the stakes. He had recently acquired the indenture papers for 2 Chinese sisters won in a game from a desperate smuggler passing through. The girls stood in the darkest corner of the saloon near the back door, their presence a silent, jarring note in the boisterous room. They were identical, their faces pale and still, their dark eyes holding a depth of endurance that seemed ancient. Finch, seeing Arthur's winning streak, saw an opportunity for a more exquisite form of cruelty. He pulled 2 folded wax-sealed documents from his coat and tossed them into the center of the table. "I'll raise you these," he announced, his voice silencing the table. A matched pair, quiet, obedient, perfect for a man living with ghosts. He looked directly at Arthur, his smile a razor's edge. After all, he added, his voice dropping so only Arthur could hear, a man who can't protect what's his shouldn't be surprised when he loses it. Maybe you'll have better luck protecting property. The taunt hit its mark. The general store, the dead woman, Lily's silent terror. It all coalesced into a single point of white-hot fury in Arthur's chest. The fog of his grief burned away, replaced by a singular, desperate need to wipe the smirk off Silas Finch's face. It wasn't about the girls. It was about the insult, about the public accusation of his own deepest fears. "Call Arthur," said his voice a low growl. He pushed his entire stack of winnings into the pot. The saloon fell into a thick, expectant hush. The turn of the final card seemed to take an eternity. Finch revealed his hand, 3 queens, a powerful hand. He leaned back in his chair, confident, triumphant. Arthur slowly turned over his cards. A full house, aces over kings. A collective breath was exhaled around the table. Finch's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of disbelief, then pure, unadulterated venom. For a moment, Arthur thought he would draw his gun. Instead, Finch shoved the indenture papers across the felt with a gesture of disgust. "They're yours, Blackwood," he spat. "Enjoy the quiet." The men at the table laughed, a hollow rattling sound. Arthur folded the papers, tucked them into his coat, and rose from the table. The victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He hadn't won anything. He had acquired a burden, a living, breathing reminder of his failure to protect the innocent. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the 2 pairs of dark, unreadable eyes from the corner of the room. He walked out into the biting wind, not a victor, but a man more deeply ensnared in his own sorrow than ever before. Behind him, 2 silent figures detached themselves from the shadows and followed him into the night. The journey back to the ranch was a long, cold pilgrimage through a landscape of skeletons. The cottonwoods were bare, their branches clawing at a gunmetal sky. The wind howled a lonely dirge across the plains. Arthur rode his horse, the girls walking behind the wagon he'd brought to town. The transaction had been ugly and inhuman, and a part of him wanted to maintain that distance. But every time he glanced back, he saw 2 figures ramrod straight, moving with a synchronized, unnerving grace, their dark coats blending into the twilight. They did not speak. They did not stumble. They simply endured. When they finally reached the ranch, the house stood as a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the horizon. He slid from his horse, the leather creaking in the stillness, and finally turned to face them. In the faint moonlight, he could see their faces were dusted with frost and their lips tinged with blue. He saw not property, but 2 terrified children trying desperately to appear strong. A flicker of something shame perhaps stirred in the ashes of his soul. He gestured numbly toward the door. In he said, his voice a rusty croak. They slipped past him into the darkness, two shadows merging with the greater shadow of his home. The inside of the house was a shrine to stale grief. A fine layer of dust coated every surface. The air was heavy with the scent of cold ash and disuse. A child's doll lay on the floor by the hearth, its button eyes staring into the gloom. The girls stood just inside the door, and their hands tucked into their sleeves, their gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving thoroughness. They took in the unwashed dishes, the cold fireplace, the single chair he sat in, night after night. He expected fear or perhaps contempt. He saw only a quiet assessment, a silent cataloging of broken things. He lit a lantern, the sudden flare of light making them flinch. The flame cast long dancing shadows. He pointed to a small dark room off the kitchen, barely more than a storage closet with a narrow cot. There, he grunted the single word, a dismissal. He turned his back, intending to retreat into his own room, but he stopped. A sound faint and rhythmic reached him. It was the sound of sweeping. He turned back. One of the girls had found a broom and was methodically clearing a path through the dust, her movements economical and precise. The other had gone to the kitchen pump, and soon the clank of the handle echoed in the oppressive silence. They hadn't waited for an order. They had seen a disarray, and without a word had begun to mend it. He watched them for a long time, a statue in the flickering lantern light. They moved around each other in a silent ballet of purpose, one gathering kindling, while the others scrubbed the grime from the stovetop. They found a half-empty sack of flour and some withered potatoes and began to prepare a meal. The scent of cooking, a smell absent from this house for a year, began to fill the cold air. It was a ghost of a scent, a memory of a life that was no longer his. He felt an unwelcome warmth spread through his chest, a thawing in a place he thought had frozen solid. He retreated to his chair by the hearth, watching them, feeling like an intruder in his own home. They were a quiet, relentless force, pushing back the tide of his neglect. And he did not know whether to be grateful or resentful. His daughter Lily was a whisper in the house. When the twins Leanne and Mai began their silent work, Lily watched them from the shadows. She would stand in the doorway of the kitchen, a small, still figure, her thumb tucked in her mouth, her gaze fixed on their fluid movements. They never startled her. They seemed to possess an awareness of her presence, acknowledging her with a slight dip of the head before returning to their tasks. They never tried to speak to her. They simply included her in their sphere of quiet diligence, leaving a small bowl of warm rice porridge on the table for her, or folding her worn nightgown and placing it at the foot of her bed. The first bridge was built over the small carved bird. It was the last thing Arthur had made for Sarah, a clumsy attempt at a meadowlark. Lily carried it everywhere, a wooden talisman clutched in her small hand. One afternoon, as she watched Mai mend one of Arthur's shirts with impossibly small, neat stitches, she dropped the bird. It skittered across the floor and came to rest near Mai's feet. Lily froze her eyes wide with panic. But Mai didn't speak. She simply set aside her sewing, picked up the bird, and held it in her palm for a moment, her fingers gently tracing the rough-hewn wings. Then she looked at Lily and offered it back. Not with a pitying smile, but with a look of shared understanding, as if acknowledging the totem's profound importance. Lily hesitated for a heartbeat, then scurried forward, snatched the bird, and retreated. But for the rest of the day, she stood a little closer, her fear replaced by a fragile curiosity. The true shift came a week later. The house was warmer now, cleaner. The scent of ginger and simmering broth had replaced the smell of dust and decay. Leanne was kneading dough on the floured kitchen table, her movements strong and rhythmic. Lily, emboldened, had crept close enough to touch the edge of the wooden table. On the mantelpiece was a small, silver-framed photograph of Sarah smiling, her face full of a light that had long since been extinguished. It was the only photograph Arthur hadn't been able to put away. Lily looked from the photograph to Leanne, then back again. Her brow furrowed. Her mouth opened. A sound emerged, a tiny rusty squeak of effort. Arthur's head snapped up from the ledger he was pretending to read. He held his breath, his heart suddenly a frantic drum against his ribs. Lily pointed a trembling finger toward the photograph. Her face was a mask of desperate concentration. The twins stopped their work, their stillness absolute. They turned their identical faces toward the little girl, their dark eyes soft, with a profound, patient sorrow. Ma. Lily whispered the sound, barely audible, fragile as a spider's thread. The effort seemed to exhaust her, and her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. It was then that Leanne, the one kneading the dough, wiped her hands on her apron, walked over to Lily, and knelt down so they were eye to eye. She didn't touch the child. She simply followed her gaze to the photograph. A flicker of recognition crossed her features. She looked back at Lily, then at the silver frame. Her lips parted, and she spoke for the first time since arriving. Her voice was clear and soft, devoid of any accent, a perfect, startling note in the silent house. "Mama," she said the word, a simple confirmation, a gentle affirmation of Lily's struggle. Then Mai, who stood by the hearth, added her own voice, a mirror image of her sister's. She looked not at the photograph, but at Arthur, her gaze piercing the thick armor he wore around his heart. "Sad," she whispered. The word hung in the air, a declaration, not a question. It wasn't just a word. It was a diagnosis. It named the suffocating grief that had poisoned the air in the house for a year. It acknowledged his pain. Lily's pain, the entire hollowed-out existence he had curated. Arthur went pale. His blood ran cold, and the ledger slipped from his numb fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. It wasn't just that they had spoken in perfect English. It was the devastating accuracy of their perception. In 2 words, these silent strangers had understood more of his family's heart than anyone in the nearby town ever had. They had seen past his gruff exterior, past Lily's muteness, and had named the monster that lived with them. He felt stripped bare, exposed in a way that was both terrifying and, to his shock, faintly liberating. The cruel joke Finch had played on him suddenly felt like an act of providence, a terrifying, beautiful miracle that had just spoken its first words and irrevocably altered the landscape of his sorrow. The world outside turned white. The blizzard came without warning, a furious, shrieking ghost that clawed at the walls of the house and buried the world in a shroud of snow. For 3 days, they were prisoners, the 4 of them sealed in the small, warm bubble the twins had created within Arthur's frozen fortress. Arthur, driven by the relentless habit of a rancher, had gone out to check on the livestock, just as the first flakes began to fall in earnest. The wind had turned on him with a predator's viciousness, stealing his breath and blinding him with a swirling vortex of ice. By the time he stumbled back into the house, his coat was a sheet of ice, and a deep, rattling cough had taken root in his chest. He collapsed before the hearth, shivering violently, the world dissolving into a feverish haze. Through the fog of his illness, he was aware of small, cool hands on his forehead, of a spoon pressing warm, bitter liquid to his lips. He heard soft, murmuring voices, not in English, but in a language that flowed like water, a soothing melodic current in his delirium. He saw faces, sometimes 1, sometimes 2, swimming in and out of focus, their dark eyes filled with a calm, focused concern. In his fever dreams, they became Sarah. He would reach out his hand, trembling, and whisper her name. The hands would gently take his hold it for a moment and then place it back on his chest. They did not correct him. They simply absorbed his delirious grief, tending to the wounds of both his body and his spirit. Leanne and Mai found Sarah's old stores of dried herbs in the pantry yarrow for the fever mullion, for the cough, and brewed potent teas that filled the cabin with their sharp medicinal scent. They knew somehow what each herb was for their knowledge, ancient and instinctual. As the fever raged, pieces of Arthur's past broke free. He spoke of Sarah, of the accident, the skirmish, where a ricocheting bullet had grazed her side. The wound itself was minor, but infection had set in a slow, relentless poison that had ultimately taken her. He spoke of the guilt that consumed him, the feeling that his past as a gunslinger, a life he thought he'd left behind, had reached out and stolen her from him. It was my fault, he'd murmur, his voice thick with delirium. My fight. My curse. The twins listened, their faces impassive, but their eyes holding a deep, resonant empathy. They did not offer empty platitudes. They simply listened, their silent presence, a form of absolution, allowing him to purge the poison of his unspoken sorrow. The blizzard abated just as a traveling merchant, a hardy man named Elias Thorne, who knew the back trails, managed to get his wagon through the drifts. He brought supplies and a letter for Arthur, one that had been waiting at the post office for weeks. Leanne accepted it, placing it on the mantelpiece. Later that afternoon, as Arthur drifted in a state between sleep and waking, he saw the letter. His fevered mind latched onto it. From my Sarah's family. He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Leanne and Mai, sitting quietly by the fire, exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. They never approved. Arthur continued, his eyes unfocused, lost in memory. Said I was trouble. Said my world would poison hers. Her brother, Silas. He swore he'd see me ruined if anything ever happened to her. He coughed a deep, painful sound. Never knew him well. Saw a picture once. Young fellow full of fire. Sarah said he ran off. Got into bad business. Always thought he blamed me for taking her away. In the quiet of the room, the name Silas landed like a stone in a still pond. Leanne's hands, which had been mending a tear in Lily's dress, froze mid-stitch. Mai, who was stirring a pot of broth, went rigid. They looked at each other, and in that shared gaze, a horrifying truth clicked into place. The cruel, handsome man from the saloon, the man who had taunted Arthur, the man whose name was Silas Finch. A terrible, tragic circle was closing, and they were standing in the center of it. They said nothing, their silence now, a shield hiding a secret too dangerous to reveal. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Arthur woke to the pale, watery light of a world silenced by snow. He felt weak, scoured out, but the fire in his lungs had cooled to embers. He was propped up on pillows in his own bed. He could hear the soft murmur of voices from the main room. Leaning against the doorframe, he watched the scene before him. Lily was sitting on the floor, a piece of charcoal in her hand. Mai was beside her, showing her how to form the character for Flower. He cleared his throat. 3 pairs of dark, intelligent eyes fixed on him. Thank you. He rasped the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. Lily held up her piece of wood, pointing to the character she had drawn. Flower, she said, her voice still soft, but clear and proud. It was the first word she had spoken that wasn't a name, the first word that wasn't born of grief. It was a word of creation, of beauty. Arthur felt the final wall around his heart crumble into dust. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet world and the possibility of a new spring. The thaw came slowly first, in drips from the eaves, then in gushing rivulets that carved paths through the snow. With it came the return of Silas Finch. Arthur saw them from the window, 3 riders cresting the hill. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in his gut. He reached for the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. Leanne and Mai herded Lily into the small back room, their movements swift and silent. They didn't look scared. They looked resigned, as if this was an act in a play whose tragic ending they already knew. When Arthur stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, Finch and 2 of his men had reined in their horses by the fence. "Well, look at that," Finch sneered, his eyes taking in the wisp of smoke from the chimney, the clean porch. "Looks like you put your winnings to good use, Blackwood." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Heard you were sick. Figured you might not have a use for them anymore. We've come to take them off your hands." Arthur's knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. He thought of the past week, of the cool hands on his brow, of the quiet strength that had pulled him back from the edge. He thought of Lily's voice hesitantly naming a flower. These men saw property. He saw the women who had resurrected his home. "They're not for sale?" Arthur said, his voice low and steady. Finch's smile vanished. "They ain't yours to sell or not sell. They're indenture, Blackwood. Paper. Just like a deed to a plot of land." It was then that Arthur Blackwood made a choice. He raised the rifle, not aiming it, but holding it as a definitive, uncrossable line. "Their names are Leanne and Mai." He said the words clear and deliberate. The act of naming them, of speaking their identities into the cold air, felt like a sacred vow. "They are under my protection. They are family." The word hung in the air, shocking and transformative. Finch stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He saw the change in Arthur's eyes, the unyielding resolve, where there had once been only drunken despair. This was not the broken man he had mocked. This was a man defending his home. "You're crazy," Blackwood Finch finally spat, though the insult lacked its earlier venom. "They ain't your kind." "They are my kind," Arthur replied, his voice unwavering. "They are the kind that show compassion, the kind that heal. Now get off my land." For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a curse, Finch yanked on his reins. "This ain't over," he snarled over his shoulder. As the 3 riders retreated, Arthur remained on the porch. The door creaked open behind him. Leanne and Mai stepped out, their faces unreadable, but their eyes shining with a light he had never seen before. They had heard everything. They had heard him claim them, but they had also heard him name the man who hunted them, confirming the terrible secret they now shared. Peace settled over the ranch, tenacious and green, like the first blades of grass pushing through the mud. The rhythm of their days found a new gentle cadence, a life built of small, significant moments. Lily's laughter became a common sound, a mix of English and the Chinese words Leanne and Mai were teaching her. The house, once a hollow shell, was now filled with the aromas of life, of baking bread and wild sage. Arthur worked with a renewed purpose, no longer driven by the numb pull of obligation, but by the desire to build something lasting. He built 2 proper beds for the girls' room, the scent of fresh sawn pine, a testament to his gratitude. He bought them bolts of soft blue calico in town, a silent apology for the rags they had arrived in. Their past remained a locked room. Arthur never asked. He recognized trauma and gave them the grace of silence they had once given him. But he saw the shadows in their eyes, the way they flinched at a sudden noise. He learned to be their shield. In town, he introduced them simply as Leanne and Mai, his tone leaving no room for questions. Lily, their fiercest defender, once told a boy who called them a cruel name. "They are my family, and they are beautiful," stunning the child into silence. One afternoon, while helping the sisters clear out an old dusty storage trunk in the attic, Mai found a small leather-bound box tucked away in a corner. It was filled with Sarah's keepsakes, a pressed flower, a lock of baby hair, and a handful of old photographs. Arthur took them with a trembling hand, memories washing over him. And then he saw it. A faded daguerreotype of a young Sarah, her face bright with a familiar smile. Her arm was around a young man, barely more than a boy, with dark, intense eyes and a defiant set to his jaw. The face was younger, leaner, not yet hardened by cruelty, but it was unmistakably the face of Silas Finch. Beneath the photo, Sarah's elegant script had identified them. Sarah and my dear brother Silas, before he left. The world tilted and went gray. Silas, the name he had muttered in his fever. Sarah's estranged brother, the man who blamed him. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about a poker game. This wasn't about indenture papers. This was a vendetta. Finch's taunts, a man who can't protect what's his, were not random cruelty. They were twisted barbs of grief and blame. He had acquired the sisters for the sole purpose of tormenting Arthur, of dangling before him two more innocent women he might fail to protect. He looked up at Leanne and Mai, who were watching him, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. They knew. They had known since his feverish ramblings. The conflict was no longer about a man defending his property or even his new family from a random outlaw. It was a deeply personal battle against the brother of the woman he loved, a man who saw him as a murderer. And worse, Arthur had to confront the terrible, gnawing question that had haunted him for a year. Was Finch right? Had his violent past a past and he could never seem to outrun? Ultimately destroyed the one person he had sworn to protect. The weight of his own guilt became the new insurmountable obstacle, a shadow far darker than Silas Finch himself. The storm gathered on the horizon, a bruised and angry purple that mirrored the turmoil in Arthur's soul. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a sense of impending violence. He had spent the days since the discovery of the photograph in a haze of tormented reflection, the knowledge of Finch's identity, reframing every memory of Sarah, every moment of his own grief. The first crack of thunder split the sky, and with it they came. Not 3 riders this time, but a dozen, cresting the hill like specters of judgment. Finch was at their head, his face a mask of grim purpose. He wasn't here to negotiate or intimidate. He was here to burn Arthur's world to the ground. "Leanne, Mai, get Lily to the root cellar," Arthur yelled, grabbing his rifle from the mantel. The polished wood felt cold and heavy, a relic of a life he thought he had escaped. As the sisters rushed Lily toward the heavy cellar doors behind the house, the first of Finch's men threw a torch onto the dry roof of the barn. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, painting the darkening sky in hellish shades of orange and red. The raid was a brutal, chaotic symphony of splintering wood, shouting men, and the terrified whinnying of horses trapped in the burning structure. Arthur fired from the porch, his shots methodical, aimed not to kill, but to drive them back. He was a protector now, his actions fueled not by rage, but by a desperate, clarifying love for the family inside his home. But he was one man against 12. They were using the fire as a screen, advancing through the thick, choking smoke. In the chaos, Finch saw his chance. While his men pinned Arthur down, he circled around the back of the house. He saw the cellar doors, saw Mai struggling to bolt them from the outside. With a vicious kick, he sent her sprawling and ripped the doors open. Leanne stood in the opening, a pitchfork held before her like a spear, her eyes blazing with defiance. But behind her, Lily screamed. That was all Finch needed. He shoved past Leanne, grabbed the terrified child, and hauled her out into the smoky air. Arthur heard Lily's cry, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror, and his blood ran cold. He saw Finch, a demonic silhouette against the fire, throwing Lily onto his horse and spurring the animal toward the hills, toward the black, gaping maw of the abandoned silver mine that scarred the landscape. "No!" Arthur roared, a sound of pure agony. He abandoned the cover of the porch, firing wildly at the retreating figure, but Finch was already swallowed by the rain and darkness. The rest of the gang their purpose served began to fall back, melting into the storm. Arthur was left with a choice: stay and fight or pursue the man who had his daughter. There was no choice. He ran for his own horse, ignoring the searing heat from the barn, ignoring the two women who were now scrambling to their feet, their faces etched with horror. The pursuit was a nightmare flight through a world dissolving into rain and mud. The thunderstorm broke in its full fury, lightning illuminating the treacherous terrain in fractured, terrifying flashes. Arthur pushed his horse relentlessly, his entire being focused on the singular goal of getting Lily back. He followed the tracks to the entrance of the old Widow's Grief mine, a place known for its unstable tunnels and sudden collapses. He dismounted, his rifle in hand, and plunged into the oppressive darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and decay. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the pitch-black tunnels. He lit a lantern, its feeble glow pushing back the shadows only a few feet. "Finch!" he bellowed, his voice swallowed by the labyrinthine passages. "Silas!" He heard a faint sound ahead, a child's sob. He pressed forward, the lantern light skittering over rotting support beams and pools of rising water. The mine was a death trap, and the storm was making it worse. A low groan echoed from deep within the earth as the ground shifted. He found them in a large cavern bisected by a deep black chasm. A rickety wooden bridge, slick with moisture, was the only way across. Finch stood on the far side, holding a terrified Lily in front of him like a shield. "You took her from me." Blackwood Finch snarled, his voice unhinged, echoing strangely in the cavern. "My sister. The only good thing in my life. You and your guns, your violence. It followed you like a curse, and it poisoned her. It killed her just as sure as a bullet." "That was an accident," Silas, Arthur pleaded, taking a step onto the bridge. "You know it was. The infection, I would have given my own life for hers. Your life is what I want." Finch screamed, pulling his pistol and aiming it at Arthur, an eye for an eye. It was then that two figures appeared from the tunnel behind Arthur. Leanne and Mai. Their faces were smudged with soot, their clothes torn, but their eyes were filled with a cold, hard resolve. Mai carried a heavy iron pry bar. "Let the girl go, Silas," Leanne said, her voice cutting through the tension. Finch stared at them, confused. "We know who you are." Leanne continued, her voice gaining strength. "We know your other name, the one the men whisper in the ports. The Serpent. You are the man who ran the smuggling operation that brought us to this country. You are the man who packed us into the hold of a ship like cattle. We know all your sins. The revelation stunned Finch. His entire crusade, his righteous fury, was built on the foundation of his sister's purity and Arthur's corruption. But here were the living ghosts of his own sordid enterprise, exposing him as a hypocrite. His grip on Lily loosened for a fraction of a second. It was the opening Arthur needed. He lunged across the bridge. Finch fired the shot, going wide, splintering the wood by Arthur's head. They grappled on the narrow, swaying bridge, a desperate struggle over the abyss. The old timbers groaned in protest. With a final desperate heave, Arthur shoved Finch away from Lily. Finch stumbled backward, his arms windmilling. For a horrifying moment, he teetered on the edge of the chasm, his eyes wide with shock. Then, with a cry that was swallowed by the darkness, he was gone. The bridge shuddered, and a section collapsed, plunging into the depths. Arthur scrambled back to solid ground, pulling Lily into his arms. He held her tight, his body shaking with adrenaline and relief, as Leanne and Mai rushed to their side. The immediate threat was gone, vanished into the black heart of the earth. They emerged from the mine into the clean, rain-washed light of dawn. The storm had passed its fury, spent leaving behind a world that felt new and fragile. The sky was a tender blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and sage. They returned to the ranch to find the barn a smoldering ruin, a black scar on the landscape, but the house, their home, was still standing. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt. The physical work of clearing the debris and raising new timbers was a healing balm. They worked together, a silent, efficient team, and their shared purpose a language stronger than words. One cool evening, Arthur gathered them on the porch. He took out the indenture papers, the brittle documents that had started it all. He held them over the flame of a lantern until they caught the edges, curling into black ash. "Your freedom was never mine to give," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he watched the last vestiges of their bondage turn to smoke. "This ranch, it's as much yours as it is mine. I hope you'll stay. Not as dependents, but as partners, as family." Leanne and Mai looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Then Leanne nodded a slow, solemn gesture of acceptance. "This is our home," she said simply. A few days later, Arthur found Lily sitting by Sarah's grave, the small wooden bird placed carefully on the headstone. He sat beside her in the quiet grass. "I need to tell you about your mother," he began. And for the first time, he told her the whole story. He spoke of Sarah's fierce love and her kindness. He spoke of his own past, of the violence he had tried and failed to escape. And he spoke of her Uncle Silas, a man so consumed by his own grief that he had tried to extinguish the light in everyone else. He admitted his own guilt not as a final judgment, but as a scar he had learned to live with. He promised her a future free from the ghosts of his past. The final act of their new beginning was a quiet one. Arthur took the small carved meadowlark from Sarah's grave. He smoothed its worn wings, then walked over to Lily, who was helping Leanne and Mai in the small plot of land beside the house. They were turning over the soil, preparing it for planting. Mai opened a small silk pouch and poured a handful of tiny dark seeds into her palm. "Seeds from our village," she explained, offering them to Arthur. "They are very resilient." Arthur looked at the seeds, then at the bird in his hand. He knelt down in front of his daughter. "Your mother would have wanted you to have this," he said, pressing the wooden bird into her small palm. "So you can remember her joy, not my sadness." Lily closed her fingers around it, a real smile, bright and full, lighting up her face. Then together, the four of them knelt in the rich, dark earth. Arthur dug a small hole with his bare hands, and Lily carefully dropped in a seed from Mai's homeland. They covered it, their hands brushing a family, planting a new and blended future in the forgiving soil.